Welcome to the show, Francisco. It's great to have you. My name is Kenton Kivestu. I am an ex-Googler and the founder of Rocketblocks, which is an online platform that helps candidates prepare for interviews, of course, product marketing interviews as well. And I'm really excited because today we have with us Francisco Bram, who is the head of global product marketing at Uber for the Uber Eats group, Uber Health, and I think a few other units as well. So it's great to have you here, Francisco. A ton of incredible product marketing experience. And I'm really excited to talk about everything you need to know about product marketing interviews with you. So welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here and excited to just share some of my experiences and nuggets to help candidates really succeed in their interview process.
Awesome. That's great. And before we get started, I did hear that there's other recent bit of news, another new launch coming up, which is that you are about to be a father for the first time. So let me say congratulations.
Thank you. That's probably the most important product launch in my life, or at least one of the most important product launches. So it is about 3 weeks from now. So I'm excited about it.
Awesome. Congratulations. Well, great way to kick things off. Let's jump into things and start with our first question here, which is we're just going to jump right into the interview topic. Tell me a little bit about what your favorite questions to ask product marketers in interviews are and why some of those stick out to you as such great questions to ask.
Yeah, I love this question. I have 3 questions that kind of build on each other.
Okay.
So one of the questions I normally like to ask after all the introductions and the back and forth dialogue is, tell me about a product or service that you really love. And here I just want to hear them talk about a product that they truly love and see how that passion for that product comes through in the way they communicate it. Then a follow-up from that is, okay, assume that I use a competitor product. How would you convince me to switch over to your product? So let's say a lot of the times, unfortunately, because it's very hard when you say that, a lot of times they pick their iPhone. And so I always say, okay, I'm a Samsung user. How would you convince me to switch over to the iPhone? And I'm actually not a Samsung user, but I'm just trying to see if they really understand their product well enough that they can communicate a value proposition, kind of test them and put them in a different sort of out of the box kind of behavior. It's something you don't prepare for. And then after they answer it, and I have a third question, which is a follow-up. And that is, now assume you're hired by Apple, as an example, to be the global product marketer for the iPhone. What would you do to further increase the growth of the product that you believe Apple is not doing enough today? And here I really want to just evaluate their ability to put your product marketing hat on with a product they truly love, that they should know in and out. What else is out there that they can do to further grow the product? And I always say Apple is always a tough one, like when people pick Apple, because it's hard to beat Apple's marketing. But I've heard great creative initiatives. And to me, that really shows that you have the right thought process. You can take on any product and quickly create a value proposition if you're familiar with the product, which is why I ask you for a product you love, not just a random product. And then I want to see how you put it together, an elevator pitch or a sales pitch, and how to convince me to switch over.
Got it. Awesome. I like that. That's also like a twist on the classic product management interview question, which starts off with what's your favorite product and why, and then jumps into how would you like feature wise improve it. But I like that twist of like, what is the unique value prop and how would you pitch someone else? Obviously that ties really strongly into the product marketing skill set for sure.
Right.
What about, tell me a little bit, as you ask questions like this and other questions that you go through in the interviews, what are some of the common mistakes that you see product marketing candidates make? If you're coming into the interview process, maybe for the first time, maybe you're shifting from another role, or you're just ramping up and you're a little bit rusty on interviewing, what are some things that folks should watch out for?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm still often surprised by some of these mistakes that people make. I mean, it's a big deal, right? You're applying for a new role. You basically, you spend most of your time throughout your life either sleeping or working. So it's a big decision you're making. And yet I find that people don't come prepared enough. And I used to call these the 5 capital sins of interviewing. And I think the number one sin is lack of company knowledge, meaning you didn't research the company. You didn't spend enough time researching the company to become familiar with the product portfolio, the industry, the competitors, even the cultural values of the company. Like, this happens a lot, actually. I'm very surprised. Here's a couple examples. I remember one time a candidate kept referring to how he's looking forward to bringing scooters and bikes to the B2B business at Uber, and which we did, and we kind of spun off that business. And it wasn't long ago. So actually, you should have just done some research, read about the news or our blog post and go through it. You would have seen that we've done that and it didn't work. We're done. Or another example is we give an exercise slides to people on the interview, and we asked them, what other verticals would you see Uber Eats potentially investing into? We are in the food delivery space and grocery delivery. What else could we enter?
Yep.
And I had people, at least one person, coming in and putting together a presentation saying you should enter the alcohol delivery space. 2 weeks after we announced that we are acquiring Drizzle and we are entering the alcohol space. So to me, it just shows that you really didn't spend enough time researching the company. And if you're applying for the company, shouldn't you do some research even before the interview? I think so. Like, that's at least number one capital sin. But then number two is you don't come prepared with examples of work, meaning you answer questions very broadly or very theoretically. So for example, if I ask, what process do you normally use to design a narrative? Or what process do you use to get customer insights? Then they tell me the theory around it, but they never give me an example of how they've done it. And I feel like the best way to make yourself memorable is to give an example. And if you tell me the approach to design a narrative, but then you give me an example of how you actually applied it, not only am I going to make notes about it, but I'm going to remember it because, oh yeah, I remember she gave me this example and it was great. So come prepared with examples of work, even if that work is volunteering work, or even if that work is, if you're just coming out of college and you did something for the university, that is also meaningful and relevant. So think about those examples. Number three, they don't come prepared with a good definition of PMM. This is a question that I always ask PMMs. How would you define PMM? And the reason for that is because product marketing varies depending on the industry. In some companies, it's mostly sales enablement. Other companies, mostly inbound. Other companies, mostly outbound. And so I just want to get a good sense of their definition of product marketing. And I'm always surprised that 3 out of 5 people don't have a good definition or don't even know how to define it, which to me is also mind-boggling. You're applying for product marketing. You should have a good understanding of what the role is about. And then the last two would be long answers. It's normal to be nervous, and it's normal in an interview that you speak a lot, but I would say try to get your answers no more than 30 to 45 seconds each. The longer the answer, more difficult it will be for the hiring manager to remember it. You're opening up the door also for potential flags, right? The more you talk, the more things I'm going to pick up on that I probably want to deep dive and may not be good because you may not be prepared to answer those. So I would say keep it short and simple and concise, and only deep dive if you're asked to deep dive. And then the last piece is people don't come prepared to ask me questions. And I also find that that's astonishing because it is a big life decision you're making. Don't you want to know more about my leadership style, how I run the team, or what are my expectations for you in your first 100 days, or how will I measure your success? These are pretty basic questions. And I think like when you're deciding on switching careers, that you need to get a good understanding that you're not coming into a role that you're not going to fulfill the expectations, or you're going to be under a lot of pressure, or maybe there's not a good cultural fit. So not coming prepared with questions is the fifth and perhaps equally important capital sin compared to all the other ones that I mentioned.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think the not coming with questions prepared is something you see across all sorts of interview types. And it's an immediate red flag for the interviewer that like, if you have no questions for him or her, or you have very few, or it seems like you're just making them up on the spot to fill some time, it immediately, I think, sets off alarm bells of like, is this person really actually interested in this company? Or are they just here collecting offers or trying to get a counter out, or maybe they're just not that interested.
100%. Yeah. You start to wonder, are you just applying because you like the name Uber on your resume? Or are you applying because, to your point, you want to get a few different offers? Like, yes, it raises flags because if you're taking it seriously, you want to really interview me. It should go both ways. And if there's not enough time for you to interview me, I've done this before as an interviewee. I asked, can I set up another time with you? Because I would love to also ask you more questions. And I find that hiring managers really appreciate that because yes, you should, because we're kind of both dating each other, right? We have to make sure this is a relationship that will work.
Yeah. Cool. And then I think that's sort of similar to where you actually started the answer to, which is about doing your research about the company. Like if you're a candidate, you come in, your first suggestion is, hey, we should launch a new business that Uber just got out of like a month ago. It doesn't look great. Do you think there's any cases where some of these companies, like Uber's a fairly big company, companies like Google, Salesforce, Microsoft, like these are massive companies. At a certain point, it's hard to know everything sort of that these companies have going on. So is there some leeway there? And how do you think about that? How much research does a candidate really need to do?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I don't expect you to come in and say, you have these many competitors globally, or I don't expect you to come in and say, here's where you're currently struggling in the industry because the competitors have this or that. I think that requires a lot of time. And if you're already working at a company, you probably don't have enough time to do that and prepare for everything else. So there's definitely a leadway. I just think there are some things that are obvious. They are so visible and out there because it's captured by the entire media. And if you just Google Uber and then click on news in Google, it immediately pops up what's recent. And I think that's a basic thing I always expect people to do, like coming in and saying you should enter alcohol when literally it's all over the place. They're acquiring this company called Drizzle. I think it shows that you really didn't spend enough time just at least going through either our blog posts, which we have a newsroom post. I normally do that when I look for a company. I go to their investor portal, I look at their financials, I look at their newsroom posts to see what else have they recently communicated. Obviously, it's not the most important thing. If you at least research the company, the portfolio, and the type of industry you're getting into, and you missed one of those 2 recent news, totally fine. By all means, I just think that if you didn't do any of the other ones before and you still make that mistake of calling out something that we clearly are not in the market for, or we just left the market, I think that shows that you really didn't spend enough time doing your homework.
Got it. Okay. So it's one signal amongst a few that you would look at. Yeah. Makes sense. Cool. Tell me a little bit, when you're thinking about evaluating a product marketing candidate, what are the skills that you're trying to suss out? Does this person have X or Y? What's really important to you in a successful product marketer candidate that you would bring onto your teams?
Yeah, I use 3 different types of interview methods depending on the seniority of the role itself. So if it's entry level, I like to do a screening conversation, then an exercise, which is kind of almost like a case study prompt, and then have the candidate talk to a few other folks. And what I normally do is in the screening conversation, I try to measure candidates' experience, motivation, and soft skills like customer empathy or customer obsession or centricity. Have you had multiple projects come through and you had to prioritize? What's your process for prioritizing? How do you collaborate with others? How quickly are you able to adapt and change if something immediately requires you to be nimble? So I try to probe those elements, those areas in the screening conversation. And then in the actual exercise, what I try to probe is more hard skills. So you'll get a prompt. Let's say, what other verticals should Uber Eats invest in? Let's say that's the prompt. And then we have a series of questions. There, what I want to measure is, do you understand how to build and design a go-to-market plan? Do you know how to build a compelling narrative that is grounded on a deep understanding of customer insight? Are you able to develop a multi-channel, omni-channel integrated launch plan? And are you measurement centric, meaning how do you define success metrics and KPIs and how do you track them? So in a nutshell, basically what I'm trying to see from their presentation is that they cover all those different elements, that they understand the core hard skills required to be successful in product marketing. If the role is a bit more senior, then what we also do is invite them to do a portfolio review. What that means is you come in and you do a presentation to a panel, and you basically walk us through all of the work that you've done that led you to being here today and being a great candidate for this particular role. And you can share examples of product launches, you can share examples of insights that help to drive product innovation. So what we want to see is that you have built a wealth of experience that really sets you up for success. Those will be for more senior roles where you potentially could be a manager as well.
Yeah.
And then in the one-on-one interviews, we just basically ask each interviewer to try to measure the different skills or cultural values that we try to in our team. For example, customer centricity is one, or acting like an owner is another one. So we try to have the conversation with each interviewer be around those particular values.
Got it. So each interviewer is going to be focusing on, like in the Uber case, a particular skill that you want to try and suss out how they demonstrated this in the past, et cetera.
Correct.
And then I think what you were saying about the case portion is really interesting, because the question that you used again was what new verticals, right, could Uber Eats enter, which is a great sort of open-ended case study question. I think what's cool for me sort of hearing that as an example is like, that's the same type of question I could sort of see getting asked in a bunch of other types of interviews, either product management or strategy and biz ops. But then when you talk about the skills you're looking to demonstrate, it was much more about go to market, around the narrative, those type of things. And I think that's, if you're one of these candidates that's looking at a few different career paths, being conscious of, you may get similar questions, but sort of how you approach it and what you need to highlight is probably going to be very different. And you need that marketing angle for sure.
100%. And I always tell candidates, this is not an exercise where there's a right and wrong answer. There's no right or wrong answer. It is more of a thought process evaluation. And to your point, if you're applying, the prompt is the same for strategy and product management. The way you're going to address the prompt is going to be different depending on your understanding of the role. So it's a good way for us to see if you really understand what the role is about and you have the core skill set to be successful in this role, as opposed to that's entirely wrong. That, like, people will come up with your total addressable market numbers. We never question the validity of the number because we know how, that's just obviously an assumption based on data that you found online. It's not about that. It's about how do you derive that number. The number itself could be entirely off. It doesn't matter. But if your process for deriving that number is a well thought out one, then you get kudos from us because that's exactly what you look for.
Right. Yeah. It's about the mechanics rather than just being sort of super precise on where you end up.
Exactly.
Yeah. Makes sense. Cool. Let's switch gears a little bit. Let's maybe focus on the more junior end of the spectrum. If you're an aspiring product marketer, you want to break into this role for the first time, what tips do you have specifically for those people that are, first time trying to break in? What should they be paying attention to as they're approaching this process and coming into these interviews?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I would say, well, I would give a couple of different categories of tips.
Okay.
One category would be preparation for the actual interview. The other one would be preparation for the journey of interviewing. And those are two different ones. So preparing for the journey of the interview would be doing a few things like try to find out if you know anyone in your network that works at the company that can give you insights about what the interview process looks like, what that particular team or department operates and how they behave and some of the work that they do. Getting some insights is really helpful. If you don't have anybody in your network, maybe you have somebody in the third or second degree that you can connect to. It helps. I would say the second thing to prepare you for the journey, look at what Rocketblocks has done in terms of what is PMM, what are the soft skills, hard skills of PMMs, what is a great PMM versus a bad PMM, how to prepare for interviews. I think doing that background will help you define in your mind already sort of all the different steps you need to start preparing for that interview journey. So that's one category. Then the actual interview itself, I think your first interview is likely going to be with a recruiter, which tends to be more of a high-level screening conversation. Yep. So there you just want to make sure that your background ties very closely to the job description and you have good examples to share with the recruiter. The recruiter will then come to the hiring manager and say, hey, I have this top 3, top 5 candidates I want you to talk to. Here's what each one of them has said and what I believe they could add value for your role. Then for the hiring manager, you need to start doing everything I said before. Research the company, the industry, the competitors. Research the people you're going to be speaking with. So if you're going to be speaking with Francisco Bram, do some online search about Francisco Bram. Try to find out what I publish on. If I have a website, what do I normally talk about? If I write blogs or if I'm part of, try to get in the mindset of the hiring manager. Not because you want to emulate him, but you want to get into the right language and you start to understand how he thinks or he or she, and you can start to prepare better for that conversation. Come prepared with real examples of your work, whether it is professional or personal work that you've done, if you're volunteered or if you've done any other type of work. Come prepared with succinct answers to the most common behavioral questions, and you can find these anywhere. You're likely going to be asked some of those behavioral questions, so come prepared with a very succinct answer. And finally, and I know this feels weird to say it, but there's science behind it. If you have the ability to negotiate the interview time, I would try to do it early in the morning or shortly after lunch. And because there's scientific evidence out there that decision fatigue is real and it does exist, especially in these environments where you have back-to-back meetings all day. And after you had breakfast or right after you had lunch, you tend to be more full of energy and tend to make better decisions. So there's tons of research out there. I could speak about this for hours, but what I would say is if you can, do it in the morning because the hiring manager is fresh, he's going to remember you, that it's going to be more engaged as opposed to later in the day where that is deprived of energy, his mind is already exhausted from being in back-to-back meetings all day.
Yep. Yeah. That's an interesting last point to bring up, the actual just sort of hack of the interview scheduling time. I do think, people definitely have, ebbs and flows of their energy levels during the day. And if you catch them at the end of the day, when it's been a long day, et cetera, it may take that much more excitement or sort of just really stellar performance from your end to sort of break through.
And actually, there's a great study that was done with, I think, about 1,000 judges, and they looked at judges giving parole to convicts. And they found that 70% of the time when judges were evaluating parole for prisoners in the early morning between 8 and 10 a.m., 70% of the time they got parole. And then between 10 and 12, less than 10% of the time they got parole. And they compared apples to apples. So they basically said they've been in prison for the same amount of time. They have the same type of prior. They are on paper likely to be both eligible for parole. Yet less than 10% of the time people got parole before lunchtime, and early in the day, 70%. It's a big difference, which also explains why Mark Zuckerberg, for example, likes to wear always the same shirt. That's what he says. It's decision fatigue. He doesn't have to think about what he's going to wear in the morning. That's one less decision. There was rumors that Barack Obama only wore 2 types of suits as well, gray and I think dark blue or black, so that he also didn't have to decide every day what kind of suit he's going to wear. Now, I don't know if these are true or not, but what I do know is that it is based on this decision fatigue.
Yeah. I've heard both those examples, and I think, as far as I know, they're both true. And I think Zuckerberg and Obama both specifically talked about like the reason is decision fatigue. And funnily, there's also the one time Obama did not wear like a dark blue suit. He wore a tan suit. He got like a ton of guff for it for like years from some of the news channels about it. So he probably really regrets that he went out on a limb there. Cool. Well, let's do one sort of last question to wrap up here. As you're thinking about these interviews, you want to go in, and there's a ton of competition for top product marketing roles, especially at some of the leading tech companies, places like Uber, where you are. What can you do to set yourself apart? How do you go, like we talked about some of like, okay, here's the basics that make sure I like perform well. But if you're going into an interview and you know there's probably going to be 3 or 4 or 5, maybe 6 really good candidates, and there's one spot, what can you do to set yourself apart?
It's a great question. I would say you should always find a way to add the extra degree of effort. This is actually part of a book I read 10 years ago, and I apply this across everything I do, especially work related. So the book premise is really simple. At 211 degrees, water is really extremely hot, but you add 1 extra degree, and then water at 212 degrees vaporizes. And with vapor, you can move a locomotive, and with a locomotive, you can move people across the country. So all that it took was 1 extra degree. And this whole analogy is great because they show that sometimes all it takes is 1 extra degree of effort, but it can mean the world of difference. And so when you're preparing for an interview, you should do everything that is standard that you should do to prepare for an interview. Everything we just talked about today.
Yeah.
But you should look at what else can you do. And I can give you 2 examples that one I did and another one someone else did that really stood out. So for example, a candidate one time came in for his exercise, and he had actually spent the whole week taking rides with Uber just to interview drivers. And he brought in those, it was only like 5 or 7 total drivers that he talked to. So obviously it's not statistically significant insights, but it wasn't, like I said, it's not about right or wrong answer. It was the approach he took. He wanted to get into the mindset of the drivers because he was considering a new vertical, and he wanted to know if drivers would be willing to support that new vertical. And I thought that was really clever, and it shows proactivity and initiative. And that's exactly what you want for a candidate. And I still remember that because he stood out compared to everyone else. For example, when I was applying for this role, I signed up for Uber Eats and for DoorDash to be the driver. And so for me, that was really insightful because number one, I saw how it is the sign up flow for both companies. I experienced what it actually feels to be driving around people or driving around food. And you also get a good insight in terms of how each company talks to you as an earner. So I brought that into my interviews, and they were all impressed. In fact, some people still talk about it today, like, oh yeah, Francisco, remember when you were actually driving for DoorDash and Uber Eats? And it's a simple thing. And I honestly, to be 100% transparent, I only did it for a weekend, but I did more than other people did. And that was the 1 extra degree of effort. And it made everyone sort of feel impressed about my initiative to do so. So what I would recommend is identify areas from your research of the company that you could improve upon. Maybe it could be a website. You look at the website and you say, this is not designed for performance. Or you look at the content on the website. It's like the product positioning is too technical. We could improve it. Or maybe the brand or naming of the portfolio itself could be confusing. So coming with those insights and offer already some thought process behind it, even if it's wrong, it doesn't matter. It means you took the initiative to actually spend time and start to put yourself in the shoes of the actual role that you are applying for. And I think to me, that's always stands out. And it shows that you are really eager to get this role. You understand what product marketing is about because you're doing it, even though you're not in the role yet. And you're doing a little bit more than is expected of you for the interview.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I agree. It almost goes back to something we started on, like some of the mistakes that you can make is like not spending any time researching, not knowing what this company is up to, not having any questions. It's right. You're on the exact end of the other spectrum right now. It's like, hey, I spent time doing extra research. I looked at the website. I signed up to be an Uber driver, things like this that really show that you're putting in the mile. And I think probably the other part you connected there, which is worth highlighting, is it's like not just putting in that extra effort, but taking it to the point where you then have insights that are relevant, right, to that role, and you're able to bring those to the table, and like they're credible, right? Like maybe it's not like a 2,000 person survey, like because that's what you do when you're on the job. Like you can't do that during the interview process, but going and talking to people shows you've got the right intuition and you've started to sort of illustrate that process, which is really important.
Exactly.
Cool. Well, I feel like this is a really great place to end. There's a ton of good sort of tips and advice you've covered throughout this discussion on product marketing interviews. So thank you so much for joining us, Francisco, and sharing your knowledge with everyone.
My pleasure. And whoever's listening, if you want to connect with me, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, Francisco Bram. More than happy to answer any additional questions.
Awesome. Sounds good. Thanks again.
Thanks, Kenton.
This podcast is produced by Sharebird, the peer mentoring platform for product marketers. It is the place to discover on-demand resources to help you with your product marketing. To view past episodes, go to sharebird.com. And if you're preparing for product marketing interviews, check out Rocketblock's product marketing interview prep tools, the best place to practice PMM interview skills and get live coaching to ace your PMM interviews. Visit us at rocketblocks.me.